You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on this.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Recently as I write this, less so as you're watching it, especially if you're not watching in early access, Answers in Genesis had a convention called Beyond Bones, The Truth About Dinosaurs. You may or may not know, but I consider that to be my turf. Now, some of the talks at this convention aren't terribly interesting to me, like the one about dragon legends being about late surviving non-avian dinosaurs, backed up by ancient and medieval art that doesn't actually look like dinosaurs. I've covered that ad nauseum, and as a result, the idea of doing it again makes me feel nauseated. So I won't. But I will do a series about Joel Leineweber's talk about whether or not birds are dinosaurs, because apparently I have infinite patience for that nonsense. Now I'm just going to assume that I don't know how to correctly pronounce Leineweber, as Joel pronounces it, so I'm going to call him Joel. I think in Germany it's roughly Leineweber, but I also suck at German, so yeah, Joel it is. One last note is that for now, when I say bird, I mean member of the taxonomic group Aves, which includes all living birds, their most recent common ancestor, and any of its descendants. Anyway, let's see what he's got for us.
Around 2 years ago, I was sitting on my couch, my wife was out of town, and I had just put the kids to bed.
Oh good, a pointless anecdote.
And there was a thud on the window of our back door.
Joel sprang from his bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window he flew like a flash, tore open the shutters, and threw up a sash. On the moon the breast of the new-fallen snow gave a luster of midday to objects below, when what to his wondering eyes did appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer, with a little old driver so lively and quick, he knew in a moment it must be St. Nick.
And I didn't really notice it, but my dogs did. We got 2 little dogs, and they ran over, and I looked outside, and there was a bird, a dove, who had flown into the window and killed itself. And so poor little dove was right there. So I did what any normal human being would do. I grabbed a plastic bag and scooped it up, and then I put together a makeshift dissection kit and put it on the table and started dissecting this dove.
I see that Joel's standard for normal is basically Jeffrey Dahmer. That's nice. In case you're wondering, you probably do not have what is needed to safely conduct a dissection of a wild animal in your house. You need trays, disinfectants, PPE, dissection pins, scalpels, etc. Using what chemicals and tools you have at home is not enough to prevent the spread of disease or injury. Please do not dissect the bodies of wild animals in your home unless you actually have the equipment and chemicals needed, which again, you probably don't have. Many animals can spread pathogens or parasites to humans even after they are dead. This isn't a laughing matter. It could be a matter of life and death, especially if you live with an already ill, immunocompromised, very young, or very old person.
That's not normal? Okay.
It's normal if you plan to progress to eating people, but otherwise, no, it's not, nor is it safe.
So then I called my wife, and I said, "You're not going to believe what I'm doing." And I said, I'm dissecting a bird on our kitchen table. And she's like, there was a pause.
If I were that wife, I wouldn't be pausing, I'd be Googling divorce lawyers.
And I expected her response was not what I expected. I expected her to say something like, "You're doing what?" Instead, she was like, "On my table?"
Yeah, the place where presumably she serves food that she'd rather not have contaminated with whatever nonsense is on a wild dove.
Apparently, she wasn't that surprised that I was dissecting a bird. I don't know.
So he's about to show actual pictures of the whole bird. If that's something you're sensitive to, I'll pause and put a timestamp on the screen for when that's over. If you'd like to avoid seeing this, then just go to that timestamp and you should be okay. If you don't mind, then keep watching. It's not spectacularly gruesome or anything, but it's not exactly a fun thing to look at either, so I won't blame you either way.
So yes, this is the poor little bird that died. Some people would say that I just dissected a dinosaur.
Those people would be correct, and I'm going to guess that at no point in this entire talk will Joel ever give us an adequate definition of a dinosaur, such that it could be used to call all dinosaurs dinosaurs, without lumping in non-dinosaurs such as Postosuchus, Lagosuchus, Scleromochlus, or Rausuchus.
Because they would say that birds are dinosaurs. You hear that these days.
You also hear that the Earth is a globe these days, and for the same reason. It wasn't initially obviously true, but it turns out that we now have an overwhelming amount of data that leads to the inescapable conclusion that the Earth is a globe, and also that birds are dinosaurs. Granted, the second one is a much more recent discovery, but it's still the same basic reason you hear both of those things.
And this idea of feathered dinosaurs is all over the place right now. You see it everywhere.
Including dinosaur fossils.
This is a screenshot from the latest Jurassic World movie with a giant feathered Therizinosaurus.
Yes, that's because in the paper A Therizinosauride Dinosaur with Integumentary Structures from China by Jingzhu et al., published May 27, 1999 in Nature, the dinosaur Bepiosaurus was described, and the holotype included very obvious preserved feather-like integumentary structures, and so because such structures were known from other theropods across Maniraptoriformes, it is reasonable to reconstruct Therizinosaurus with such structures. And in fact, it's no longer reasonable to reconstruct it without them. Think about it like this. This is a gray wolf. This is a brown bear. This is a tiger. You'll notice that all of them have fur. The fur isn't the same, but they still all have it. Now here's the skeleton of Amphision. We know it's definitely more like the bear and the wolf than it is like the tiger, and they both have fur. And if they both have fur, and the more distant tiger also has fur, what are the chances that Amphision had fur? Well, basically 100%. Anyone who reconstructed a naked Amphision would need to do some serious explaining if they wanted their reconstruction to be taken as a reasonable one. Similarly, we have these filaments in animals like Bepiosaurus, Eutyrannus, and Sinosauropteryx. The default, then, is that animals like Therizinosaurus were indeed covered in hair-like strands that are often called protofeathers.
Or this dinosaur, Pyroraptor.
Well, the thing about Pyroraptor is that its remains are so fragmentary that I can't really say anything about it. Jurassic World Dominion reconstructed them as dromaeosaurs, the family to which Velociraptor belongs, but it's not actually clear if that's what they were. Nonetheless, we know from examples like Microraptor that dromaeosaurs were fully feathered, including with modern-looking remiges. And we also know that these remiges were deeply rooted to the bone, like modern bird remiges, because of the presence of ulnar quill knobs on Velociraptor. You see, the deeply rooted feathers on the trailing edge of the wings actually leave behind scars on the bone they attach to in the form of small bumps. These bumps are seen on both modern birds and Mesozoic dinosaurs, even in some very basal ones like Concavenator. So, if we're going to assume that Pyroraptor was a dromaeosaur, which is plausible, then yes, it had plumage. In fact, more than Jurassic World Dominion gives it.
You can do a Google image search for feathered dinosaurs, and it'll come back with thousands of images.
I mean, that's true, but you can do a Google image search for just about anything and it'll turn up pictures. That's true for things that are real and for things that aren't. I typed Bill Clinton and found thousands of images that came up. I typed mermaid and thousands of images came up. That doesn't mean that Bill Clinton is fake or that mermaids are real, just that there are a lot of pictures of them. Other than the fact that feathered dinosaurs are a meme, I don't know what point Joel is trying to make.
Now you can even ask AI to generate a feathered dinosaur for you, and it'll happily comply.
Well, yeah, generative AI is designed to give you pictures of whatever you ask it to. You could get it to give you feathered elephants if you want.
This was a toy that someone I know found in a church's Sunday school classroom.
A cute little oviraptor, a group of dinosaurs we now know were feathered because of their preserved brooding behavior in which they draped their arms over the eggs in such a way that they couldn't have been insulated by the parent unless the parent had feathers. So our options are that oviraptor has a hugely maladaptive brooding strategy, or that it had feathers. Since maladaptions don't tend to last long, the feathers is the much more likely option.
Now, I don't blame anybody. I'm sure somebody just picked up a bunch of dinosaur toys and they put it in the classroom, right?
The idea that anyone would think this is blameworthy is on its own weird and creepy to me. It's a reasonably accurate dinosaur for toy babies. It's not driven by some agenda.
But this idea is showing up everywhere, and it's hard. As a Christian, it's important for us to know how do we handle this issue?
The fact that science learning new things is an issue for Joel's theology is a problem for his theology. If your theology requires you to simply reject aspects of objective reality, then your theology is wrong. Joel's theology is wrong, at least to the degree that it requires that he reject parts of reality. To the degree to which it does not do that, then it is only possibly wrong. My recommendation would be that he get a theology that is entirely only possibly wrong, rather than one that is demonstrably wrong in at least some places. If he thinks that negates the whole of the gospel, then I'd recommend he stop being a Christian. Most Christians belong to denominations or ecclesial bodies that do not require that evolution be false for their theology to work, so he could also just join one of those groups.
So it's been a pleasure working with some great scientists and researchers on this here at Answers in Genesis.
If you have to lie about science, you're not a great researcher or scientist. If you have to ignore data, you're not a great researcher or scientist. All of those so-called researchers and scientists at AIG do both.
And the research we've done over the last several years turns over 100 years of evolutionary dogma.
Wow, that's pretty amazing, and I'm sure that this conclusive evidence is about to be published in an actual journal where the claims will be reviewed for accuracy and completeness by people who aren't just other creationists who start with a required conclusion, making them definitionally pseudoscientists, right? No, of course not. This is just a rewording of the old chestnut that evolution is a theory in crisis, a crisis that has been ongoing for like half a century without any evolutionary biologists actually noticing. That they have science that has overturned evolution just waiting to be released is a whopper of the likes that even Elizabeth Holmes or Elon Musk would be embarrassed to make.
And it's just really exciting. Over 100 species of animals, we've reviewed hundreds and hundreds of books and scientific papers on this topic.
What does that even mean? AIG has reviewed organisms? What does that look like? Is it like Tier Zoo but for creationists? The lava cricket is an A-tier insect, but the botfly is F-tier?
So let's see where you guys are on this topic. Because some of you might be thinking, well, dinosaurs and birds, they look so different.
I am not thinking that, because that is a silly thing to think. It's like thinking that mammals and whales look so different. I mean, sure, when asked to draw a generic mammal, I'm certainly not going to draw a whale. But it doesn't matter how unusual within mammalia whales are, they're still mammals. Similarly, no matter how atypical compared to dinosaurs as a whole birds are, that doesn't make them not dinosaurs.
I bet you I can tell the difference. So,
I bet ya he can't, and won't even try. Remember, to say that Group X is not part of Group Y, you first have to define Group Y, then Group X, then show why X does or does not meet the criteria to be in Group Y. I'm guessing he won't define either bird or dinosaur in a way that actually lets us identify either.
what do you think? Does this look like a dinosaur or a bird? Shout out your answer.
That's Velociraptor with broken fingers. It's a dinosaur.
Looks like a dinosaur. How about this one?
That's also Velociraptor with a beak we know it didn't have, since you can tell if a skull had a beak in life because the cuticle for the keratin of a beak leaves behind a texture on the skull. And also, it is in a position that would cause it to tip backwards because the tail is too long for it to maintain balance with the femora nearly horizontal, as they're positioned in this. Also, the fingers are no longer dislocated, which is nice. It's still a dinosaur. And unless you want to use bird extremely broadly, it's not a bird. It's also certainly not a bird in the traditional Linnaean sense.
That looks like a bird.
The fact that whatever AIG artist made this had to lie about Velociraptor to get people to say that it's a bird should be a red flag to any person actually interested in the truth.
There's just one problem. That's the same skeleton. Both of those drawings are based on the same skeleton.
Was that supposed to be a reveal?
Same bones, just posed differently. One pose makes it look like a dinosaur. The other pose makes it look like a bird.
Both poses make it look like a dinosaur, because whether it's a dinosaur is based on actual features of the bones that don't change because you simply put them in a different pose. It also doesn't help that neither pose is actually biologically possible, since one is unbalanced and the other has dislocated finger bones. Dinosaurs characteristically have a deltoid pectoral crest on the humerus that takes up 30 to 40% of the humerus. Does this skeleton have that? Yep, right there. So it looks like a dinosaur. Other characteristics of Dinosauria, like the perforate acetabulum or the asymmetrical forked trochanter of the femur, or the arrangement of the astragalus and calcaneus in the ankle, are not visible from this lateral view, so I can't use them to say if it looks like a dinosaur or not.
And the fossil evidence doesn't do much for us, doesn't help us very much with knowing how the animal was posed in life.
Well, it does. First, don't dislocate bones. Second, don't unbalance the animal. Those are good starting points. But also, the pose doesn't matter as to what it is. Humans don't become dogs if they go down on all fours, and kangaroos aren't humans because they stand on 2 feet.
It's hard to tell. So, what criteria can we use?
Good question. You can use the actual anatomical definition of a dinosaur. like the aforementioned deltopectoral crest of the humerus and the shape of the fourth trochanter of the femur, but also things like a crocodile reverse ankle joint between the calcaneus and the astragalus in the ankle, 3 or more sacral vertebrae, a strong connection between the transverse processes of those same sacral vertebrae and the sacral arches, a femoral head that's distinctly offset from the shaft and turned medially, allowing the animal to hold its legs parallel to the sagittal plane, reduced or absent 4th and 5th digits on the manus, no claws on digits 4 and 5 of the manus when present, etc. The problem, of course, is that when you do this, birds come out of the wash as dinosaurs, regardless of how you pose their skeletons.
If all we have is the bones in many cases, what criteria can we use? How do we know the difference between a dinosaur and a bird?
By using the anatomical definitions. Of course, you'd also have to show how the anatomical definition of birds precludes it from also meeting the definition for dinosaur, but that's like 3 steps into the process, and we're not even at step 1.
Well, you might have some ideas running through your head, so let's talk about what some of those might be. Here is a skeleton of Archaeopteryx, and you might see some things on this animal, and you might say, well, that doesn't look like a bird.
Yes, specifically teeth, lack of a beak, unfused metatarsals, unfused metacarpals, and carpals in the manus, lack of inverted hallux or big toe, although the skeletal reconstruction on screen falsely shows them inverted, the long maxilla, and the long bony tail all show it's not a bird, since birds diagnostically have fused metatarsals, fused manus, carpals, and metacarpals, no teeth, a short maxilla and long premaxilla, a beak or bill, an inverted hallux, and a short bony tail that ends in a ptegostyle that is itself made of fused caudal vertebrae. So I can say with complete confidence that Archaeopteryx is not a bird, if by bird we mean member of the taxonomic group Aves. If Joel has some idiosyncratic definition of bird, then sure, whatever, maybe it meets that. But if the whole talk is just an argument over where on a taxonomy to stick the common word bird, then he's not really engaging with science or evolution or even worldviews. He's just arguing that he wants some things called birds without that meaning anything for their anatomy or evolutionary history or lack thereof.
Like there's claws? Look at those big claws.
Not something I mentioned. Many birds have claws on their wings, although no extant bird has 3 as far as I'm aware.
Do birds have claws on their wings?
Yes, although no claws is common in Neo-Aves, which are birds that aren't paleognaths, like ostriches and emus, and aren't in Gallo-Anseri, or the fowl, like swans and chickens. Interestingly, the same group that has claws is the same group that has penises, something else most birds lack. Well, they're not technically penises in the mammalian sense, but they're intermittent organs, so good enough for government work.
Actually, go to the grocery store, pick up a chicken wing. On that first digit there, most likely, most of the time, it'll have a little claw.
Many companies actually remove the very tip of the thumb on chicken wings, so you may not find a claw there, but yes, like many birds, chickens have thumb claws.
Well, you say that's not really a claw, it's just kind of a little nub, right?
No, I would not say that. Whether it's a claw is a matter of the anatomy, not the size of the structure. It's a keratin sheath over an ungule digit, so it's a claw.
Well, how about this picture? This is an ostrich. Look at the size of those claws. We just don't see them very much because they're usually covered with feathers. Turns out, almost half of the families of birds have members with wing claws. Claws on the wings are just part of God's design for birds. Surprising.
Maybe it's surprising to people who have never looked into avian anatomy and diversity, but it's not surprising to me. Also, the graphic does not actually have each bird belonging to a different family, which is odd. In fact, the family Anatidae has at least 3 different birds pictured: a wood duck, Aix sponsa, a mallard, Anis platyrhynchus, and a mute swan, Cygnus olor. The last one seems to be from a population introduced from Eurasia to North America, since the picture is by Janet Griffin Scott, who, based on her portfolio on alamy.com, is a wildlife photographer from North America who focuses on birds, primarily waterfowl and birds of prey.
Well, you might say, well, what about fingers, right? Like that Archaeopteryx, it looks like it has 3 fingers. Dinosaurs have fingers, but birds don't really have fingers, do they?
Yes, birds have fingers. In fact, they have the same 3 fingers as tetanurine theropods. That is, the group that gave rise to birds. The difference is that birds have those fingers fused into a carpometacarpus. Archaeopteryx doesn't.
So again, look at this ostrich photo. You can't see fingers. There's no skin wrapped around separate fingers, really. But if you look at the skeleton, you can see, oh, there's 3 digits there.
See, now this is starting to really annoy me, because this is showing 3 unfused metacarpals and proximal phalanges that are also not unfused. But that's how an embryonic bird wing is arranged. This is an actual photograph of actual ostrich wing bones. You'll note the extensive fusion that his illustration neglected. The only reason that I could see why someone would do this is to try to trick people into thinking that the hands of Archaeopteryx and Struthio, that is the genus to which the ostrich belongs, are more similar than they are, in an attempt to downplay the transitional nature of Archaeopteryx.
Now, they're fused a little bit.
More than a bit, and that fusion isn't in the on-screen illustration.
And that's something we find in modern adult birds. If you look at that chicken wing on the right there, you can see that blue bone. It's actually 4 bones all fused together in an adult bird. So most adult birds fuse together like this. They're those 4 bones into something called the carpometacarpus.
No, not most birds. All birds. That's a diagnostic feature of birds. No carpometacarpus? Not a bird. In the sense of a member of Aves. If you want to speak about birds in the broad sense, then sure. But then again, we're just talking semantics. If all Joel wants to do is broaden the range of animals that people call birds, that does nothing to argue for or against their evolution within Dinosauria.
It's really fancy science speak for the carpal and the metacarpals fused together.
That's true.
But in juvenile birds, they're separate. Those bones are separate.
Right, and even in our oldest, most mature Archaeopteryx, the Solnhofen specimen, which is an adult, the fingers are separate, meaning that according to what Joel just said, it doesn't count as a bird. But you know who's really good at figuring out what is and isn't a bird under multiple definitions? My patrons and channel members. So why not check out my Patreon, where you can, for as little as $1 a month, gain access to scripted videos like this months early, as well as my super secret Discord server just for supporters. You can also get a 15% discount by pledging annually. Alternatively, you can get a channel membership starting at $1.99 a month, and gain access to the same videos and Discord server, but also get a cool green name in my live chats and access to channel emojis and a monthly milestone chat at no additional charge.
And when we look at the fossils, you can see we find them in various stages of fusion. Some of them are fused, some of them are less fused. It seems like
an evolutionary sequence. Thanks for doing my job for me, Joel. It's hard for me to imagine a better graphic illustrating the differences in hand morphology going from the very basal Archaeopteryx all the way to extant modern birds. Although, honestly, I'd swap Cathiornis and Sapiornis. Although I do notice that now we're labeling Microraptor as a dromaeosaurid, which is the family to which Velociraptor belongs. So I guess Joel is doubling down on David Menton's claim that Velociraptors are birds? Which is odd, since as far as I know, the Creation Museum still has a scaly, unfeathered raptor hanging out in their Garden of Eden display. Oh well.
In some of these pre-flood animals, they were less likely to be fused for some reason.
The reason isn't a mystery. It's that the fusing of the carpals and metacarpals is a derived trait of Ornithoraces, the group that includes modern birds and their Mesozoic cousins, the enantiornithine birds. Archaeopteryx and all other animals from his list of so-called birds are not members of Ornithoraces, and so have not evolved the carpometacarpus.
But that doesn't mean they're not birds, so you can't use the fingers to tell whether they're a bird or not.
Actually, it does mean that, because the presence of a carpometacarpus is traditionally diagnostic for identifying an animal as a member of Aves. And even though we know it to be an apomorphy of a slightly wider group, Ornithoraces, you have to have the apomorphies of the wider group to be placed in a smaller subgroup, meaning that having a carpometacarpus doesn't mean one definitely is an Aves, but lacking one means one is definitely not an Aves, and therefore not a bird in the traditional sense.
What about the teeth? Archaeopteryx had teeth.
Lack of teeth is diagnostic for the group Euornithes, which is the smallest group that contains Aves and anything else. Basically, it's actual birds in the traditional sense, plus the single genus Archaeorhynchus, meaning that just like having a carpometacarpus is a necessary condition for being an Aves, but is not sufficient, having teeth is a disqualifier for being an Aves, meaning that once again, Archaeopteryx is not a bird in that sense. It is transitional.
Well, modern birds, we don't find teeth. We do find, on some birds, a serrated beak, but that's a different structure.
Joel should tell Kenthoven. He still pretends that it's actually teeth.
But if we look at fossil birds, there were numerous fossil birds found that did have teeth. There's 6 examples there of different species of fossil birds. Clearly birds. Evolutionists even agree that these animals are birds, but they had teeth.
So what does it mean that so-called evolutionists call these birds? Well, mostly nothing. Remember, bird isn't a scientific term. That's why I have been clear about using it to mean member of the taxon Aves. But scientists aren't beholden to that rule, so why am I bothering with it in this response to an Answers in Genesis talk? Well, because they said that. In the poorly edited blog post, The Debate Over Classification of Archaeopteryx as a Bird, by AIG employee and paleontology PhD, Gabriella Haynes, published on September 14, 2022, we can read in the abstract, quote, "Many controversies remain regarding the feather taxonomic classification flight capabilities, its evolution, and whether Archaeopteryx is a transitional form, a reptile with feathers, or a bird. This paper's scope is to briefly discuss the latter controversy because it has kept creation and secular scientists' view divided. The history of Archaeopteryx findings, their historical interpretations, the role of Linnaean and cladistic classification methods, and the implications of all that on Archaeopteryx classification were analyzed. End quote. So AIG's pet paleontologist is concerned with the Linnaean classification of bird, which if you go read that book, you'll find is Aves.
But wait! There's more!
The abstract ends with, quote, based on a biblical worldview, logical grounds, the anatomy of the skeleton and skull, the presence of feathers, and following the traditional Linnaean classification, no reason remains for Archaeopteryx to be classified as anything other than a bird. So clearly Dr. Haynes thinks that the traditional Linnaean classification of birds is important and should be used to guide the discussion on birds. And remember, Hayes is the in-house Answers in Genesis paleontologist publishing in their in-house blog that pretends to be a journal, even though it demonstrably is not. In the section Archaeopteryx, a dinosaur with feathers, we get this wonderful quote. Quote, the presence of feathers has been key to classifying an animal as a bird based on the classical, conventional, and traditional taxonomy developed by Linnaeus in the 18th century. Gauthier and de Queres, 2001. However, various workers have changed and adapted the classification system before and after Darwin, Amorim, 2002. The Linnaean classification was based on similarities in creatures, but in contrast, Darwin's classification is based on their supposed ancestry. Amorim, 2002. One can see that the data never changed because the animals and their features have been the same. Instead, the lenses used to interpret them changed. End quote. So we shouldn't be messing with what Linnaeus wrote. Apparently, that dude was inspired or something. Later on in the section, cladistics uses different and ambiguous terms and definitions. We find this. Quote, so for definition purposes, it is essential to highlight that the word bird used here is defined in the classical, traditional Linnaean way. End quote. Seems like a pretty strong position is emerging from the woman who, I'll remind you, is the AIG paleontologist writing in their official research blog. So according to Answers in Genesis, in the closest thing we have to an official statement by one of their alleged experts, we shouldn't mess with Linnaeus. So what did he have to say about birds? Well, let's check his book, Systema Naturae. The 10th edition is where we first find his inclusion of birds. What are the characteristics that, according to Linnaeus, who, let's remember, is the guy to ask about birds according to AIG's paleontologist, are as follows. Heart, 2 auricles, 2 ventricles, warm, dark red blood. Lungs, respires alternately. Jaw, incumbent, naked, extended, without teeth. Eggs, covered in a calcareous shell. Organs of sense, tongue, nostrils, eyes, and ears without auricles. Covering, incumbent imbricate feathers. Supports, 2 feet, 2 wings, and a heart-shaped rump. Flies in the air and stings. Later in the 12th edition, we have a much longer discussion. Quote, this beautiful and cheerful portion of created nature consists of animals having a body covered with feathers and down, jaws protracted and naked, wings 2 formed for flight, and 2 feet. They are aerial, vocal, swift, and light, and destitute of external ears, lips, teeth, scrotum, womb, bladder, epiglottis, corpus callosum and its arch, and diaphragm. The feathers are disposed over each other in the form of quincunx intermixed with down, distinct from the quill and tails, feathers, convex above, concave beneath, narrower on the outer side, lax at the fore end, hollow and horny at the base, with a central pith and furnished on each side with elongated shaft with parallel, approximate, distinct, flat laminae, composing the vein. They vary in color according to age, sex, season, or climate, except the quill and tail feathers, which are more constant and chiefly characterize the species. The eggs are various in number, size, and color, but always covered with a calcareous shell, deposited in an artificial nest and hatched by the genial warmth of the parent. The body is oval, terminated by a heart-shaped rump, and furnished all over with aerial receptacles communicating with the lungs or throat necessary for flight or song, and which may be filled or emptied at pleasure. The rump has 2 glands, secreting an unctuous fluid which is pressed out by the bill to anoint the discomposed parts of the feathers. Bill horny, extending from the head, either hooked at the end for tearing prey, or slender for searching in the mire, or flat and broad for gobbling, and it is used for building nests, feeding the young, climbing, or as an instrument of offense and defense. Furnished with orbits and a nictitant membrane, ears truncate without auricles, wings compressed, consisting of movable joints and covered with quills and feathers. Legs placed usually near the center of gravity with toes and claws of various shapes. Tail serving as the rudder or director of the body. They are mostly monogamous or live in single pairs and migrate into milder climates upon defect of food or warmth, and a few become torpid in winter. The generic characteristics taken from the bill, tongue, nostrils, cirri, carnacles, and other naked parts. End quote. So do any of these animals count as birds according to the definition that Dr. Hayes of Answers in Genesis insists we must use? No, they do not. Nothing with teeth is a bird. Nothing without a beak is a bird. Not according to me, according to Gabriella Haynes, even though she then went on to argue that Archaeopteryx is a bird, which is a bit confusing. So anytime that Answers in Genesis wants to say that something that's not an aves, which was originally defined by Linnaeus, is a bird, I get to call foul. See what I did there? That's why I'm sticking with aves as what I mean by bird, at least in this series.
Teeth and beaks.
Sinornis didn't have a beak, but whatever.
So at this point, you might be ready to throw your wings up in the air and say, maybe birds are dinosaurs.
Yeah, they are, and I'd like to point out that we're still not at step 1 with Joel here. Remember, the first steps are to define the categories in question, bird and dinosaur. He hasn't done either. He's just jumping into pictures of skeletons and declaring that things are birds without any reason provided.
Dinosaurs and birds are very different.
Okay, let's get some definitions. That would be nice.
And we're going to talk about 7 major differences between dinosaurs and birds today.
Well, that doesn't bode well. Look, I could give a talk in which I give you 7 major differences between whales and mammals. Watch, let's do it. 1. Whales have only 2 limbs. Mammals have 4. 2. Whales have a tail fluke. Mammals don't. 3. Whale pelvises don't connect to the spine, but mammal pelvises do. 4. Whales have flippers, not feet or hands, like mammals. 5. Whales have blubber. Mammals don't. 6. Whales are born tail first. Mammals are born head first. 7. Whales are water animals, but mammals live on the land at least sometimes. Well, I have now shown that whales aren't mammals in the style of Answers in Genesis, showing us that birds aren't dinosaurs. Of course, you might notice a problem. You probably learned in school that mammals are animals with fur or hair that nurse their young on milk and give live birth. While that's not quite the technical definition, that definition does include only mammals, and whales meet the definition. It turns out they also meet the more technical and detailed definition too. So what I've really done is point out ways in which whales are unique among mammals, not ways to tell that they are not mammals. In order to do that, I'd have to pick something about whales, for instance hair, and argue that whales don't have hair. Of course, whales do have hair, as you can see in this picture, but at least then I'm trying to actually find something that makes a mammal and point out that whales don't have it. Or I could try to argue that whales don't actually produce milk. Of course, this picture of a nursing calf might belie that, but still, if it were true, it would be great evidence against whales being mammals. But note that I can only do that after establishing that hair and milk are vital to an animal being a mammal. So let's see why birds are unique among dinosaurs in a way that doesn't in any way make them not dinosaurs.
Now, some of you might have noticed something else about Archaeopteryx. The bony tail. Raise your hand if you noticed the bony tail. Anybody see that?
I did, but my arms don't really go above my head, so excuse me for not raising a hand.
Extra credit points to you guys. Good job. Bony tail. The tail, turns out, is very important, and we're going to talk about that later.
Thanks for being a tease, Joel.
But first, I want to quickly touch on this question. Couldn't God have created dinosaurs with feathers?
Assuming the existence of a creator god with the attributes usually assigned to him by people who think like Joel, yes, he's omnipotent, so he can do whatever he wants.
Could he have done that? Yes, absolutely. We're not going to limit God and say he couldn't have done something. But the joy of science is finding out what God did do.
Well, he made these dinosaurs with feathers, if he made them at all.
So it's not a question of whether he could or not. He could have. But let's look at the evidence. And we want to start with what?
Fossils of dinosaurs with feathers, I would think.
God's word.
Oh yeah, I forgot. Joel Leineweber doesn't give a shit about empirical evidence. He just cares about his interpretation of his favorite Iron Age compilation of myths and legends.
Right, we want to start with the Bible.
One of the characteristics of pseudoscience is starting with a conclusion and then working backwards to fit the evidence to that conclusion, rather than starting with the evidence and seeing what conclusions can fit it. When Joel says to start with the Bible, do you think he's being a pseudoscientist who starts with a conclusion, Or do you think he's being a scientist who starts with empirical data?
So what day of creation week were dinosaurs created on? Anybody know? Shout it out.
According to Genesis 1, the land animals were made on day 6, and the flying creatures and sea creatures were made on day 5. But this doesn't really mean anything for the question. Take, for instance, animals like sea turtles, sea snakes, and whales that rarely or never come on land, despite being in groups that are normally thought of as land animals, that is, reptiles and mammals. What day were they made on? What about bats? Presumably they're day 5 animals, but the rest of mammals, apart from whales, are on day 6. So if reptiles as a whole and mammals as a whole can be split between days 5 and 6, why cannot dinosaurs, a subset of reptiles, not be the same way? The flying dinosaurs were made on day 5 and the land-bound dinosaurs on day 6.
Day 6, very good. Genesis 1:25, God made the beasts of the earth according to their kind, and the livestock according to their kind, everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. How about birds? What day of the week did God create birds? 5, very good. Genesis 1:21, so God created every winged bird according to its kind, and God saw that it was good.
Well, first, the word there translated as bird is oaf, which in Leviticus 11 explicitly includes bats. So clearly the word oaf does not have the same semantic range as the English word bird, and means something closer to winged animal that flies, rather than just bird. So bats are created on day 5, but most mammals on day 6. Similarly, we can simply say that birds are created on day 5 and the rest of dinosaurs on day 6 without there being any trouble for this literalist reading of Genesis. This whole argument doesn't even work if we assume the truth of young Earth creationism. It's hard to imagine a worse argument.
So this is just one of many ways you can tell from Scripture that God didn't use evolution, right?
That's not the same question. Did God create dinosaurs with feathers is one question. Are birds dinosaurs is a second question. Did God create via evolution is yet a third question. These can all have different answers, and answering one doesn't answer the others.
There's numerous ways. Evolution takes millions of years. God created in 6 days. That makes it pretty obvious.
Well, it makes it pretty obvious that a literal reading of Genesis 1 is simply not something that corresponds to reality, because here in reality we have overwhelming evidence of universal common ancestry for cellular life and the great antiquity of both the Earth and the universe.
God created things after its kind, right? Animals don't turn into other kinds of animals.
To borrow something from my last video, I've pointed out several times before that part of the reason that creationists can't seem to understand even the most basic concepts in evolutionary biology is that their concept of organisms is fundamentally Neoplatonic, but modern biology has found that organisms actually cannot be fit into Neoplatonic forms the way that creationists want them to be. They are simply continuing in the ancient Christian tradition of using ancient Greek philosophical concepts to frame how they see the world. It turns out, at least in the case of Neoplatonism, this philosophy is wrong when applied to living things. There is no form of a dog. Dogs are a lineage within wolves, and there is no essential dogness that exists. There are just organisms whose genomes can vary over time to any degree, but which won't ever stop being dogs, no matter how unrecognizable they might be. The concept of kinds, as Joel is using it, is just some ancient Greek philosophy dressed up in Hebrew clothes that's badly translated into English. It has no biological reality and was not anything like what the authors of Genesis or even creationists until the mid-21st century would recognize.
But I think God has a sense of humor, and just to mess with the evolutionists, he created birds the day before he created dinosaurs, just to make sure we were absolutely clear on that issue.
I can guarantee that no working evolutionary biologist cares at all what the order of creation is in the Bible and bases none of their work on either conforming to that or trying to contradict it. It matters as much to them as the idea of the floodgates of heaven in Genesis 7 matters to working meteorologists. As much as the idea that mating animals near stripy strix results in stripy offspring from Genesis 30 matters to animal breeders.
So Genesis 1:21 says, a winged bird. It can literally be translated flyers or flappers with wings. And it turns out the concept of the wing is pretty important. So let's do a little science. You guys remember the scientific method?
I remember that there isn't simply the one and only scientific method. That's more talk that's characteristic of both creationists and flat earthers. Weird how much alike they are, isn't it? Each branch of science has its own particular method. What they share is empiricism and hypothesis testing.
Let's start with a hypothesis.
About what? I think we have to start with an observation.
And then we are going to make some predictions based on that hypothesis. We're going to test those predictions. and then we'll come to a conclusion. So that's kind of the scientific method.
Maybe if you include observations and you're targeting the explanation to babies, then sure.
So our hypothesis is going to be that God only created feathers on birds.
Well, he'll need to first demonstrate that God created anything at all, a tall order in scientific terms. Then he'll need to define clearly what a bird is, which hasn't happened yet. Then finally, he'll need to show that no other known animals have feathers. That's a lot of stuff to do. I don't think there's time in this talk to even begin.
All right? We'll see if that's true. We're going to test that. That's our hypothesis. Seems like a reasonable hypothesis.
Well, since it's got an entirely untestable aspect to it, that an omnipotent actor did something, it's as unreasonable as any hypothesis could ever be. Anytime you put God in there, regardless of whether or not there is a God, you've made yourself a hypothesis that is completely unscientific, because it's not subject to testing that could falsify it.
When we look at the world today, living animals, we see feathers on birds. We don't see feathers on reptiles.
Birds are reptiles. Remember, when we look around, we see flukes on the tails of whales, but not of mammals. So I guess whales aren't mammals, just like birds aren't reptiles.
When we look at Genesis, we see that God created birds on a different day than he created land animals.
Yet more reason to show that whales aren't mammals, since those are land animals made on day 6, unlike whales, which are sea animals made on day 5. How can whales be mammals if they were made the day before mammals, right?
So, seems like a reasonable hypothesis. Well, let's talk about feathers. Feathers do come in different types and variations, but the key thing to remember about feathers is that they're all branching structures.
This is, in fact, not true. Many birds have non-branching feathers called bristles that are used similarly to mammal whiskers as sensory organs. Man, this guy can't even get birds right, never mind all of Dinosauria. Some bristles branch at the proximal end, as on his diagram, others don't.
All right, you can see all the 6 different types there. They all have a main quill or rachis, and then they all have some type of barbs coming off of them.
Yeah, in that diagram that's true, but in real life, bristles are usually not branching.
So that's an important thing to remember. A feather is always a branching structure.
Except when it's not.
Now we do find things called filaments on some dinosaur fossils. So this is a Sinosauropteryx. It's a compsognathid dinosaur.
That's true.
And you can see those fuzzy things along its neck, right? Those are called filaments, but they aren't branching structures.
Like most bristle feathers. Okay, I'm following so far.
Most likely collagen fibers or something like that.
No, we know for certain that these are not collagen fibers, and we know that for pretty simple reasons. The groundbreaking paper Fossilized Melanosomes and the Color of the Cretaceous Dinosaurs and Birds by Fu Cheng Zhang et al., published in Nature January 27, 2010, conclusively and directly refuted the claims from Fiducia, Lingam Soliar, and Wang that these are collagen fibers. I really want to impress on you the degree to which it is the case that this paper absolutely deleted this argument from serious consideration in paleontology. So what did this paper do that showed that these specific fibers, along with pretty much the rest of what Fiducia and Pham were complaining about, were definitely not collagen fibers? Well, they found melanosomes. Melanosomes are organelles produced by melanocytes, and they unsurprisingly contain melanin, which is one of the main color molecules in animals. All humans make it to various degrees, except albinos. There are 2 kinds of melanin, eumelanin, which is a very dark brown color, and pheomelanin, which has a rusty reddish-orange color. Melanocytes produce melanosomes, and they are generally expelled from the melanocyte into the surrounding intercellular matrix. But this is where it gets important. This doesn't happen in collagen fibers because those are themselves protein chains, whereas integumentary structures like scales, feathers, and hair do have melanosomes. That's what gives them most of their color, except in cases where structural color is more important, like in most green or blue feathers, and all iridescent feathers. So a good way to tell if these filaments are integumentary structures, like unbranched bristle-type feathers, or if they're just frayed collagen, is to check for melanosomes. No melanosomes means that collagen is a pretty good explanation. Yes melanosomes means that collagen has been ruled out. Well, the researchers found melanosomes, and even found them in patterns like rings on the tail of Sinosauropteryx, and they also found that Sinosauropteryx had raccoon-like bandit markings on its face. Now, this paper came out in 2010, and this talk came out in 2014. So AIG has had 14 years to come up with some argument that's better than the 2007 arguments of Fiducia and Company. They have not done so, because there are no good arguments. This is a lie, and they know it.
We don't know for sure yet, but that's what a lot of scientists think.
We have known for sure for 14 years. Joel is just lying. And by a lot of scientists, he means about as many as even I could count on one hand without running out of fingers.
And so, it doesn't look like feathers. So we've got this difference, right? Filaments, and we've got feathers.
Except that, as we've seen, some feathers are filaments, and in order to get from basal and tegumentary structures like simple placos to complex scales, you're going to have to go through transitional stages. And even before the fossil filaments were found, they were proposed as stage 1 protofeathers. So we expect, if birds are dinosaurs, to also have dinosaurs with the more basal filamentous protofeathers, and that's what we have. That's the transitional feature right there. In the fossil, Joel himself showed us.
But evolutionists keep trying to use the word feather to include both.
That's because birds still and have always had filamentous feathers. And even if they hadn't, it would be a required transitional stage, so the only reason not to call these feathers or protofeathers is if you want to lie to people to trick them into thinking there's less evidence for the dinosaurian affinities of avians than there really is. Now, Joel wouldn't do something that's so nakedly propagandistic in order to trick his credulous audience of scientific illiterates, would he?
Right. Well, we're not going to do that in this talk. When I say feather, I mean a branching structure. I'm not talking about filaments.
I'm using a stipulative definition for bird, so I guess I can't tell him he's not allowed to use one for feather. But let's remember that what sounds humans associate with these concepts doesn't actually do anything to change the underlying physical reality or the data that scientists can gather about it.
And when we find feathers in the fossil record, like on this animal on the left, which is a dromaeosaur called Microraptor, and Archaeopteryx on the right, one of the most famous fossils in the world, when we find feathers on them, they're fully formed, complete branching structures, just like birds today.
Okay, but that's entirely because he defined protofeathers out of the feather category. Like, what did I just say about using stipulative definitions and how it doesn't actually change the data? The fact is that we have transitional protofeather structures, and just not using the word feather to refer to them doesn't make them go away. Like, if I decided to redefine human to mean Homo sapiens above the age of 19, that doesn't suddenly mean that humans can't make babies because I can't find any baby humans. The only reason I can't is because I decided to not define babies as humans in my stipulative definition. That doesn't change anything about the life cycle of humans. Similarly, if he just defines protofeathers as not feathers, that doesn't make them go away or mean that we don't find them. It just means he's playing word games when he tries to say that that's what's happening. He knows he can't actually deal with data honestly, so he just does a semantic vanishing act to pretend it doesn't exist. But it does.
So why do evolutionists conflate these two ideas of the filament and the feather into one word?
They don't. They just aren't using Joel's stipulative definition. Because why would they bother? They're not the ones pretending that the data don't exist because they decided to define a word narrowly to let them do so more easily.
Because they're trying to tell a story, right?
Not any more than any other scientists. Joel is showing on screen the stages of feather evolution as they were predicted, and then the dinosaur groups that we have actually found to have physically possessed such feathers. And on top of that, the more modern the feather, the closer the rest of the animal's anatomy is to modern birds. This is, as I've been told, the gold standard in science. It's hard to imagine how much better a transitional sequence could be if you drew an ideal one from scratch. If birds and their feathers had in fact evolved from more basal dinosaurs and dinosaur integuments, what does Joel think it would look like, if not what we have? I don't know.
They're trying to tell a story of how feathers evolved. Feathers are the most complex integumentary structure in creation. They're amazing.
That's true.
But how is that a problem? Paleontologists aren't proposing that feathers on modern birds aren't as complex as they are. In fact, a big part of the reason they predicted protofeather stages is because this complexity probably wasn't present in the basalmost integumentary structures that were homologous to feathers. And instead, the complex branching was probably something that evolved. So that's what scientists hypothesized, and that's what they found in a stunning demonstration of the predictive power of the theory of evolution. Where are the creationist predictions of filamentous integumentary structures in dinosaurs, and how the pattern of their structures should map onto dinosaur taxonomy? Oh, right, it's so nowhere that they're still lying about the physical structures themselves, some decade and a half after their best argument has been nuked from orbit.
Very complex. And so they need to explain how feathers came from something else.
I mean, yeah, that is kind of the point of evolution.
So you can see stage 1 and 2 in this supposed feather evolution. Those are the filaments, right? And we do find those on some of these dinosaur families in the lower left there.
Importantly, the place where we really start seeing stage 2 feathers are in the coelurosaurs, the group of theropods that are beginning to have bird-like adaptations, like carpal bones allowing the hand to hold against the ulna, as in birds, as well as metatarsals that, while not fused, are pressed against each other for greater flexibility, like we can see in tyrannosaurs.
And then stages 4 and 5, those are branching structures. They're feathers. They're just two different types of feathers that we find on birds today. Stage 3, they haven't found those yet.
That's not entirely accurate.
But even if it were, this is just a Dr. Banjo argument.
Fair enough. But where, then, is the missing link between apes and this Darwinius Macilli? Answer me that, Professor.
Oh, okay, granted that one missing link is still missing. But just because we haven't found it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Pshaw! Things don't exist simply because you believe in them.
Further, we have in Sinosauropteryx structures that are actually intermediate between stages 2 and 3, and in Peniraptora, that is oviraptors, Deinonychosaurs, and birds, we have examples of transitions from stage 3 to 4. So while we don't have any completely unambiguous stage 3 protofeathers, we have things that are transitional on either side, and remember, the central aspect of stage 3 is the development of barbules, which are also so delicate that they're not even always preserved in true modern types of feathers when those are preserved. So it's actually quite likely that some of the feathers that currently seem like intermediate stages between 2 and 3 are actually stage 3 feathers.
They're completely hypothetical. This was a diagram based on a diagram from National Geographic magazine, and you can see stage 3 is just a little question mark there. Maybe it happened around here.
Just doubling down on the Dr. Banjo argument, I'd play the clip again, but that seems risky copyright-wise, so I won't. You got the point the first time. But yeah, in any transitional sequence, no matter how complete it is, until we have a fossil of literally every organism ancestral to any living thing alive now, which is impossible, there will be points in the transition that you just don't have. But just like you can still tell what the picture is supposed to be on a 1,000-piece puzzle, even if a few dozen pieces are missing, the fact that all transitional sequences will always be missing a few transitional stages that would be nice to have, doesn't mean you can't figure out the whole picture. And further, the existence of transitional sequences at all are evidence of evolution and against creationism. Now, this is not because they are a dichotomy, they are not. Evidence against evolution is not necessarily evidence for creationism, but because creationism says no evolution, evidence of evolution is evidence against creationism, and confirmed predictions in the form of transitional species in the fossil record are direct evidence against creationism.
So it's very different, and you can see there's two different groups of animals.
I don't even know what two groups of animals he means, although I do notice that his cladogram of theropoda is in fact wildly different than the consensus. In fact, he has tyrannosauroids as maniraptorans in his cladogram, which is absolute nonsense. Ornithomimids and therizinosaurids are Maniraptoriformes, and so should be closer to the Maniraptorans than Tyrannosaurus is, but he's got Tyrannosaurus right next to the true Maniraptors with Oviraptorosauroids, Avialans, and Deinonychosaurs. Now this is a mess. This is just chaos.
So if we look at a group of what they would call theropod dinosaurs, these non-avian dinosaurs.
Well, not all theropods are non-avian dinosaurs, but the ones pictured all are. Although the Herosaurids may not be theropods at all, and they're on here.
There's a subgroup inside of there called Maniraptora.
Yep, and it looks like he's correctly identified Maniraptora, although in doing so, he's contradicting his earlier chart that had Therizinosaurus and the related Bapiosaurus being farther away from other Maniraptorans than Tyrannosauroids, and now he's saying that they're just not Maniraptorans, which is correct, but that's incompatible with his chart. So now I'm not actually sure what he believes about what is and isn't in Maniraptora. It's almost like Joel has no clue what he's talking about and can't read a cladogram. Either that, or he really doesn't care about being honest or even coherent.
And if we look at all of the fossils where we find real feathers, they're all found inside of this group. They're all found inside of Maniraptora.
Well, given his stipulated definition that only modern type feathers count, yes, that doesn't negate the fact that protofeathers have been found in many of these other groups, and also strong evidence for some kind of feather-like integumentary structures has been found in many more groups, such as Allosauridia broadly, in the form of quill knobs on the ulna of Concavenator, and even in ornithischians like ornithopods and ceratopsians, who have filamentous structures that are structurally essentially the same thing as stage 1 protofeathers from organisms like Sinornithosaurus. So while it's true that using his definition, Maniraptora, and more specifically Peniraptora, a slightly smaller group, are the only animals with modern-type feathers, that is completely in line with the predictions of evolutionary history.
Now, we do find filaments outside of that group, but just filaments. We don't find feathers outside of that group.
Right, but those filaments match the predicted forms of protofeathers, so the fact that he doesn't want to use the word feather when talking about them doesn't change their transitional nature. After this, he says he's going to jump into the 7 dramatic differences between dinosaurs and birds that we were promised a while ago, back before we went on this odd tangent about feathers that amounted to little beyond word games. That seems like it would make a perfect breakpoint for a new video, so that's what I'll do. We'll end it here for now and pick back up next week, unless you're watching in early access, in which case it'll be whenever I get it done. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur.
Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Tovand, Phil Cavara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, Strawberry Vein, Dr. Tapioca Weasel, Elron Teller, Horseflesh, Ian Chen, Calvin Brostig Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, Sphincter of Doom, and Ballas. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.